Hello and welcome back. Today we are going to start a new lecture series on industrialization. In America, we're going to go back a little bit. We're going to go back and forth between, kind of pre-Civil War America and post-Civil War America. We'll be spending most of our time talking post-Civil War America, but what you have to understand is a lot of this stuff, the development of industrialization, started before the Civil War and continued through the Civil War, and is really going to go all the way through World War II. We're going to talk about the beginning stages, which is that time period just before the Civil War, all the way really up until like right around World War One. So that's the time period. Now, that's not the time period, full time period of industrialization, right? I mean, it's going to go much long. It's going to be much more expansive than that. But for our purposes, because we only have a certain amount of time, we're going to discuss pre-Civil War a little bit, but then mostly in between the Civil War and World War One. So America, up until this point, has pretty much been agrarian, meaning farmers, and rural. We are going to be rural, meaning living out in the countryside, all the way up until 1920. So the process is a slow process, but industrialization is what's going to change us from that farming, rural kind of lifestyle to an industrial, city-based lifestyle, right? You got to have, for factories to work, you have to have a large population of workers, which means you need the development of cities. And so industrialization is what's going to get us away from farming and living out in the country to manufacturing and living in the cities. We're going to, be able to make goods faster than ever before because of industrialization and using machinery and advanced techniques to make the workplace more efficient. And making things faster is super important because if you make it faster, you can make more of it. If you make more of it, you can sell it cheaper, which means there's going to be a surplus of goods that Americans can choose from. I mean, there's two ways, and I got to be clear here. There's two ways if you really want to help poor people. We always focus on how can we pay poor people more, and that's important because we want to be able to pay people as much as possible. But the other way you can help poor people is bring down the cost of goods. And so, capitalism and industrialization will definitely bring down the cost of goods. Now, initially, it's not going to do a very good job of increasing pay. But as we start to regulate our capitalism and move away from laissez-faire capitalism, we'll start to be able to do both, where we'll be able to pay people more and produce things cheaper. And so that's really going to help out a lot. So the standard of living is going to increase for everybody. It's definitely going to increase for rich people more than poor people. But because we make goods available cheaply, it will increase for poor people. Plus, if you can come up during the industrialization period with some sort of new invention or new product, you can become fabulously wealthy, which means that people in America are constantly inventing new things that makes life better for everybody, rich, middle class, and poor. Right? I mean, we've gotten so good at creating new technology that today in 2020, your cell phone holds all of mankind's knowledge, and you put it in your pocket, and we can make it so cheaply that everybody has one, whether you're rich or poor or not. Very, very few people don't have cell phones. And that's what industrialization and capitalism are going to do. Now, it's going to be a windy road to get there because there's going to be abuses because our government hasn't figured out how to regulate industrialization yet. So we're not going to pay people very well initially, but we will work that out with time. There's going to be no environmental regulations. You can take a look at just an average city during industrialization. There's going to be all kinds of environmental problems because we haven't figured out that we need to regulate, these businesses to make sure they're just not dumping pollutants out into the environment. People are going to be living in there's no housing requirements, safety standards, sanitary standards, and so these cities become really cesspools for disease and just nastiness. We don't have those regulations yet. And so we don't have them yet because, we kind of didn't know that we needed them. We wanted to encourage business growth because we wanted the economy to grow. And we didn't realize that if we didn't put some regulations in place, that these businesses would just go crazy with it. And so, we've got to figure out the balance between letting businesses invent new things, make things cheap that we all benefit from, create jobs and whatnot. And we have to balance that with the bad stuff that happens, which is when they don't pay their workers enough, when they make them work long hours in unsafe conditions, when they dump pollutants into the environment, and we have to learn how to regulate that. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about during the industrialization period. The American economy is hands down the greatest economy in the world. We are the wealthiest people in the world. As a matter of fact, if you're born in America and have a full-time job, you are most likely in the top 1% of wage earners in the world. That's how great our economy is. And we have the highest standard of living for any major nation in the world. And so, that's a great thing. Now there's going to be bad things that happen along the way, and it's not a perfect system. There is no perfect system. So we got to talk about, how did we get that great economy? Why are we the wealthiest people on the planet? And which that's a great thing. But then, what are some of the downsides to that? And so, in the beginning, there's a whole lot of downsides to it. Today, like I said, it's not a perfect system, but it's definitely, like you just compare the way that we live. Go watch an episode of International House Hunters and, see how the average person around the world lives compared to what the American middle class lifestyle is like. And it's not just the middle class too. Most of the world doesn't have indoor plumbing, and not really a problem in the United States. So how do we get this great economy? And then kind of what is the darker side of that, which is definitely in the beginning stages of industrialization, it's going to be workers not being paid enough, having to work long hours in unsafe conditions, environmental issues, and whatnot. So how do we get there? Well, the first reason is the government just got out of the way, and this is going to be great for business owners. It's going to be great for the overall economy. It's going to be great for innovation, coming up with new products, and it's going to do that. It's going to definitely it's going to create jobs. But the downside of laissez-faire is businesses can essentially work their employees 12, 13, 14 hours a day. They can use child labor. They can make employees work 6 days a week. They don't have to make sure that their factories are safe, so people get hurt. They don't have to offer disability, or if a machine cuts your arm off, they just fire you, and there's no sort of social safety net with welfare. Hopefully you just go to a church, and a church will give you some food to survive or whatnot. It's a pretty bad thing. And so laissez-faire good for the creation of our economy, for creating wealth, creating jobs, creating innovation. Bad for the way that it treats workers. And so, what is laissez-faire? Well, it means hands off, and the hands in particular, it means the government's hands off. The government doesn't regulate the economy. That a supply and demand regulate prices and wages. If people are willing to work 14 hours a day for next to no money, then that's the market saying that that's okay. And so business owners will do that. And if they offer too low of wages, people won't volunteer to do that work. And so, essentially laissez-faire says that's fine. Well, we know today that that's not true. Some people are desperate and they'll have to work essentially for starvation wages. So, our system of capitalism today is a regulated form of capitalism. It is not laissez-faire capitalism, because we're going to talk about all kinds of problems that this creates. 14-hour workdays, 6 days a week, and unsafe conditions, that's never going to allow the average worker to be able to, live in anything other than kind of this abject poverty. It's not going to give them enough time to get an education, to maybe, get a skilled labor position that pays more to make their life better. So, we will move away from laissez-faire. It's just going to take us some time to figure out how much to regulate. Because on the other side of regulation is if we regulate too much, then potentially businesses will fail. And if they fail, then there's no innovation, there's no new inventions that make our life better. And, if they fail, then there's no jobs created. And so, this is kind of like the political debate today, how much regulation is enough. And, typically your Republicans will say there should be no regulation, and Democrats, today, Bernie Sanders is talking about total government regulation. Well, what's the answer to that problem? Well, like all things, it's probably somewhere in the middle. We have to let businesses innovate. We have to let them, have freedom to think on their feet. But at the same time, we can't let them take advantage of workers and of society. And so, this debate, there's no right answer to it. Anybody who's trying to tell you that there's a right answer to any of these questions is trying to sell you some sort of political ideology, and is not actually trying to solve the problem. So, the one of the other great motivators for our economy is the idea of individualism. This is the pick yourselves up by the bootstraps. That if you work hard enough, great things will happen to you. No matter how humble your origins, and guys like Andrew Carnegie are going to go from being an orphan to one of the richest men in the history of the world, and so that's true. Now, we have to be honest, though, that is not going to be true for everybody. In capitalism, we've talked about this in the past. It is all about the individual. It means that the individual has freedom to choose. You can choose your career. You can choose to be a farmer, or you could choose to work in a factory, or you could choose to be an artist, or you could choose to be, a doctor or a musician or whatever. Well, but what that is going to mean is based on your choices will determine how far you rise. And also, there's some conditions in an unregulated version of capitalism where if you're, born into a poor family and mom and dad work 16 hours a week in the coal mine, and you live in that town and the only job is in the coal mine, you're probably going to end up in the coal mine and remain poor, unless you make some drastic choices to leave the coal mine and head out west and start a farm, which is very difficult to do. So the idea that everybody can pick themselves up by the bootstraps and become rich, well, that's not the case. What individualism really means is you have the opportunity for that. And so if you're smart and hardworking and willing to take risks, you increase your ability to move up the social ladder. Individualism is not a promise that if you work hard, that you'll move up the socioeconomic ladder, that you'll go from being poor to being rich. What individualism means is you have the freedom for the opportunity to move up the social ladder, socioeconomic ladder. And again, not a perfect system. It is, but we do have, because of individualism and this idea that if I work hard and make good choices, like go to school, learn a job skill, save more money than I spend, take the leftover and invest it, that you can move up the socioeconomic ladder. And there is more social mobility like that in the United States than essentially anywhere else in the world. And so the idea, and this encourages people to work hard, right? Unlike a socialist system where everybody gets paid the same, right? There's no incentive to go earn a job skill, learn any kind of skill, or to get an advanced education, or to work overtime. There's no incentive to that, because why do we do that in America? Well, it's because of individualism, that if we do all those things, we can ask for a raise, or we can, start our own business, or do all that because there's rewards for that hard work. In, say, a socialist system, there's why create a new product? The government's only going to let you have so much money anyway. why learn a job skill when which takes time and effort and sacrifice when everybody gets essentially paid the same anyway. And so individualism keeps us motivated to work hard. It keeps us innovating, trying to figure out cheaper ways to make things, quicker ways to make things, new products to make a buck, because you then get rewarded for that hard work, unlike socialist systems or capital or communist systems. So another reason for our success is we are in America blessed to have an abundance of natural resources. We're essentially self-sufficient. And so this economic term called the American system is going to pop up. And essentially what the American system is that each part of the country has different resources, and we can essentially be independent, economically independent, by capitalizing on all those different resources. The North will build tools that the South will buy to farm, right? And the South was going to farm the cotton for textile and clothing. They'll sell that cotton to the North that will turn that into clothes. And then, the West will buy the clothes and the tools and the cotton from the North and the South, and they'll farm, and so they're buying stuff from the North and the South, and then they're farming and growing food that they're going to sell to the North and the South, and so we have this kind of like circular trade in the United States. Well, we can only do that because we have an abundance of natural resources. We've got iron. We've got oil. So iron to be able to make steel and tools and all the industrial things that we need. We've got oil that will, at first, we're going to use for kerosene so we can work at night, and so extend the working day. Rockefeller's going to make kerosene safe for everyday use. Then eventually for the combustion engine with gasoline, we've got waterways to transport our goods, the Ohio River. We're going to have the Mississippi River, the Great Lakes, all of that. We're going to have and I think this is probably key, and the thing that's going to make us truly economically independent. We have the most fertile soil in the world. So out west, we're going to be able to grow a surplus in food. We are a net food exporter. So we not only grow enough food for everybody in America to eat, but we feed significant portions of the rest of the world, which means that no matter what happens to our economy, we don't really have to worry about food in the United States. And so that's huge. We've got a very diverse economy. So that means if one part of the economy is struggling for whatever reason, which always happens, we're not really going to feel it that much because we got other parts of our economy that are going to keep everybody working. And so, this is super, super important for economic growth. We've got coal, iron, lumber to be able to, for the shipping industry, to be able to build boats initially, to be able to build homes, all that good stuff. That's important. We're also going to have, in the Northeast, a very vibrant fishing. Fishing economy in the Northeast, and so this is it definitely beats being a country that is mostly desert and doesn't have a lot of resources, or even some economies like Russia and Saudi Arabia today that seem very wealthy because they've got all kinds of oil money, but when there's dips in the oil market, their entire economy collapses. We have we have sufficient amount of oil in the United States. We are a major oil producer. As a matter of fact, in 2020, we are a net oil exporter, so we make enough for us to use domestically, and we sell some abroad. But when the oil market tanks, which it does every once in a while, it doesn't really affect us very much because it's just one small part of our economy. So you can see here's a map of all the different resources. We've got iron ore, oil fields, railroads, sawmills. A lot of that resources early in our history is going to be located kind of in the Northeast. Hence why most of the major industrial cities, manufacturing cities are going to be in the Northeast. If you're going to build a factory that makes nails out of iron, you don't want to do that in the South where there's no iron, because then you have to pay somebody to dig up the iron in the North, put it on a train and ship it down south before you make a nail. No, it makes much more sense to put your nail manufacturer right next to the iron supply because it'll cost much less money to get that resource to you. Eventually, though, you're going to make so many nails that you can't just sell them to the people in your town. And that's when the railroads come into play. You can then put them on a railroad and cheaply get them out west where they're in high demand. So, other reasons for economic growth are going to be government policies. Remember, the government is laissez-faire; it's hands off. So it's not telling businesses that they have to have minimum wages, which would drive down profits. It's not saying that you can only work people 8 hours a day. So that's what they mean. But it's not truly hands off because they are going to offer subsidies to help businesses get off the ground, and so they'll give cash in some cases, but mostly land to businesses to try and encourage them to grow. And we think that that's going to help everybody. And it kind of does because it creates more jobs. The more we help businesses, the more businesses there are, the more jobs there are, the more people working, the more money they have to spend. And that's good. But that's only part of the equation. The other part is we got to make sure that those people are getting paid enough to survive. So we're going to help businesses expand dramatically by giving them, land in a lot of cases to be able to expand their businesses. The best example of that is the railroad, and we had talked about that in a previous lecture under the frontier and settling the West. We're also going to see high tariffs. So these protect American manufacturers. A tariff is a tax on an import. We've talked about those in previous lectures. And so we're putting taxes on British goods that are coming into the United States, which makes them more expensive, which means Americans are going to tend to buy American products. We are not allowed to in the United States tax exports. We can only tax imports, and trade amongst the states is guaranteed by the Constitution. So when America is created, we are created with the largest free trade zone in the world, right? The people in Kentucky can trade freely with the people of New York. And so that is a massive advantage that we have. Then when we put tariffs on European goods, during this time period, 97% of Americans bought American-made products. I mean, that's tremendous help to American businesses. And every time, and as we're getting more and more immigrants being pulled to the United States because there's so much social mobility in our country, there's so much ability to go from being poor to the middle class and even to the upper class, that there's more and more people moving into America, which means there's more and more people buying American goods. And then laissez-faire that essentially allowed businesses to pay very low wages and work their employees very long hours. This will ultimately be taken advantage of and will lead to the rise of the labor movements and eventually regulation on business like hours and wages and conditions. They'll create minimum wages and child labor laws as well. So the other reason for strong economic growth is population growth, right? Because our economy is so strong, it's not the strongest in the world in the 1800s, but by the time we get to the 1900s, it will be. And so there's, unlike in Europe, where the class system is essentially stratified. There's no more land to expand to. They're having the same problems with factory workers. There's just if you're born poor in Europe during this time period, you're going to remain poor the rest of your life. Now, in America, you might be born poor and you might die poor. If you make bad economic decisions or if your situation is just so bad it can't be overcome, you're gonna struggle for sure. So America's not a perfect system, but it provides the most social mobility out of any of the other systems in the history of humankind. I mean, that's No small statement there. And so that means immigrants are going to be just dying trying to get into the United States because there's at least an opportunity to work hard, take some risks because it is risky, and be able to get yourself out of poverty and into the middle class. And so by 1900, we've got close to 76 million people. That means a couple things. So, why is having more people good for the economy? Well, it means two things. It's going to create a large workforce. So, we're going to have plenty of workers. So, businesses are going to be able to hire a lot of people to make products quicker, which means they can make them cheaper so they can sell more of them. So that's good for everybody because we get cheaper products, which makes our life better. And two, it creates a market. All those people that are coming here working in the factories, they're making money. And when they're making money, guess what they do with that money? They spend it. And so when they spend it, they're spending it at a business. And so that means they make more money. And when they make more money, they hire more people. And when they hire more people, that's more people making money, which they spend, which creates profits for businesses. So they expand and they hire more people, and those people make money and they spend it, and it's off to the races. And so if you can continue a population growth in your country, which you can't do forever, eventually you run out of room, right? But while your population is growing, your economy is going to be growing too, because workforce and markets. A market is just people to sell goods to, is what that means. And so, excuse me. Right, you get eventually you get this strong working class to be able to buy goods, and ultimately that's the goal. And so you'll start to see the emergence of the middle class, even though it's a very difficult thing to break into, particularly working in factories. There are middle management positions that eventually you can rise to, and so it's a good thing for the economy. The other thing that's going to happen is we're going to see advancements in machinery and technology. Most of the industrial revolution really starts in Great Britain. Samuel Slater here is going to bring essentially the first major industry to America, and that's the textile industry. What they're doing is they're taking like raw materials like cotton and turning it into bolts of fabric that can then be used to make clothing. And so, what Samuel Slater does is he actually memorizes the blueprints for a textile factory in Great Britain. There are very strict laws in Great Britain because they have a monopoly on the textile industry about starting factories elsewhere. You're not allowed to do it. You can't take the blueprints of these factories out of Great Britain. Well, what Samuel Slater recognizes is there's a huge opportunity to make massive amounts of money in the United States because they've got cotton in the South and a growing population. So what he does is just ingeniously, he memorizes the plans for one of these factories, comes to the United States, builds a factory, and all of a sudden we're now off to the races, which means we're going to go from a society that your clothes were essentially like handmade, or like if you're rich you could afford a tailor that can make you a really great suit. But most of America, it was the wife or the mother would just do the best she could to make clothes. They weren't very good quality and they weren't very consistent, and it was just a long drawn out process to cheaply made mass produced goods. And so Samuel Slater and his spinning wheel and his mass production plants are really going to change America. It's going to provide women jobs, right? So a lot of these poor families where the male income isn't enough, or if a woman just doesn't get married, they can find jobs in these textile mills. They're not great jobs. Most women would rather just get married and have their husband, be making the money at this time. But it does provide options, and that's because of the cult of domesticity that we've talked about in several different lectures. All right. We're also going to see the advancements in energy, power sources with electricity and petroleum. Kerosene that Rockefeller doesn't invent but makes safe with his Standard Oil Company is going to light up the night. And so that's going to increase the workday, which means, for factories, all of a sudden now you can run them a little bit longer. Normally, when it got dark, you had to go home. But it's also going to help farmers out on the farmer's field. They essentially had to be working out on the farm all day, and then it would be dark at home, and you could maybe huddle around the fire for a couple hours before you went to bed. But once you have kerosene, you can have lamps, which allow you to potentially work harder so you can make more money working in the night, or it allows you to just spend a little extra time at home with your family, reading, bettering your life, just think about today how awful life would be if when it got dark outside, you had to go to bed. We spend most of our waking hours working, and that's not a good work-life balance. Kerosene is going to start to change that. Eventually, what will happen is we'll realize that the byproduct of making kerosene is gasoline. And so we'll see people start to use gasoline as well with the internal combustion engine. Eventually we'll get cars and things of that nature. So out of kerosene develops gasoline. We're also going to see guys like Edward Drake, who's going to use steam drills to be able to drill in places like Cleveland and Pittsburgh, which are going to allow more efficient drilling to be able to get to, petroleum products, but also iron products and whatnot. And so, this is going to be a huge advancement. It's going to make, metal, the being able to use a steam drill to be able to get like iron ore out of the ground is going to make things produced out of iron much cheaper. Iron eventually, through the Bessemer process, will be turned into steel, which is going to totally revolutionize America. We'll talk about that in later lectures, particularly when we talk about Andrew Carnegie. But also, by the time we get to 1932, we're going to have I said 1932, 1832. We're going to have our first, practical electrical generator. So we're going to be able to produce electricity. It's not going to be in wide use until we get to 1870, when Edison is not going to invent the light bulb, but he's going to create a version of a light bulb that is long lasting, that's going to be actually useful. And then we'll start to see the electrification of America, and think about how critical that is. A kerosene lamp, it gives you a little bit of light at night. Electricity, totally going to change America. We're going to be able to run factories 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, which means, you're going to have shift workers. Factories will be able to employ twice as many people because of electricity. You will be able to motorize much more things, which makes, us produce goods faster, which means things will be cheaper, which is dramatically going to help poor people. It's going to make all that stuff safer as well. And so when Edison, is able to advance the light bulb and essentially start the process of electrifying America, which he gets the credit for, which Nikola Tesla is actually going to, be a more vital role in that. But what Edison does is essentially creates an Edison Electric, which is going to really push for electrification around the United States. Edison Electric will be bought out by J.P. Morgan, who is an investment banker. We'll talk about him more in future lectures. But J.P. Morgan is going to turn Edison Electric into General Electric, which is still one of the largest American companies around today. And so all of these things are happening because America is a capitalist society that rewards innovation. And, so we get all these great changes. Now, there's still abuses, right? These guys are working their employees too long and not paying them enough. But they're creating these gigantic companies, which creates tons of jobs and, making products cheaper and increasing the standard of living by making all of our lives better by creating these products. And so, the new products are great, the new jobs are great, but we still have to work on making sure that the workers get paid a fair wage. We're going to see increases in communication technology, which is going to speed up the advancement of settling the West. One of the big problems with settling the West is, we got to be able to talk to them and connect our country. And so Samuel Morse is going to, help invent Morse code and the telegraph. And so the telegraph is the system just below me here. Sorry, let's go back. Right, this right here, and essentially sends a little electric impulse, like boop, and that makes a noise. And so Morse code are the beep pop boop pop noises that can be translated on the opposite end to be able to send messages back and forth. And so this really connects the economy because it allows you to essentially send messages out east that say, hey, we need to ship more lumber out to Colorado. We need more lumber. We need more iron out here. And so it allows us to trade better. Eventually, Alexander Graham Bell, right? I think we understand that he's going to invent the telephone, which is really going to make that efficient. Morse code is not super practical. You're not going to have a telegraph in every house, and people have to learn Morse code, which is essentially a whole new language. Alexander Graham Bell and the invention of the telephone is really going to speed up communication, connect our country, and allow for much better trade. The next major reason for economic growth in the United States is war. There's no doubt about it. War can be an economic stimulus. Now, why? Well, when you're fighting a war, the government has to buy stuff. It's got to buy boots for the soldiers. It's got to buy food for the soldiers. It's got to buy guns, and it's got to buy bullets. It's got to buy all of those things, and so those industries are going to boom. They're absolutely going to boom, and so it's good when you fight war. It's going to employ people in those factories. It's going to employ soldiers because they've got to go fight it. While they're fighting, they're getting paid, but they're not spending money. So when the war's over, they come back into the economy and will spend more money. And so we're not talking about war is good here, by the way. Sometimes war is good and is justified, although bad things happen in it and people die, right? World War II, stopping Hitler from committing genocide, right? That most people would argue that is a good thing. We're just talking about the economic side of war here. And so you see this boom in demand, and all of a sudden, all these businesses hire more people. You're going to see guys like Eli Whitney, who is famous for inventing the cotton gin, is going to invent interchangeable parts in the rifle industry, which means we can start to mass produce guns. And so that's going to be, wildly important in the economy because you can't mass produce things unless every single part is the same. And so that's how you mass produce it. So Eli Whitney really does that with interchangeable parts in the rifle industry. And so you get all this boom. But the downside to war is almost always when the war is over, we see a recession, right? We see bad economic times because all these businesses, they hire new people to meet the demands that the government is buying all these stuff. So if I own a rifle factory and there's a war, the government says, hey, I know you normally only make, 1,000 guns a month. I need you to make 10,000 a month. Well, what do I have to do to be able to increase my production by 10 times? I have to hire more people. I might have to buy a bigger factory, and I have to buy new equipment. I got to take out loans to do that. I'm willing to do that when the government's buying 10,000 rifles a month. But then eventually all wars do what? Well, if you said end, good job, you won. When the war ends, all of a sudden now I'm back to selling 1,000 rifles a month. Do I need all that new equipment? No, but I took a loan out. I still got to pay for it, right? Do I need that new factory? No, but I took out a loan. I still got to pay for it. And do I need all those employees now? No, so I got to fire them. And so all of a sudden, when the war's over, you tend to see, larger unemployment because that factories are laying people off, not because they're mean, but just because they don't need them anymore. But those businesses took out loans to get a bigger factory, and they took out loans to get new equipment, and then all of a sudden a lot of these businesses will end up failing because they're not making enough money to pay those loans back if they weren't smart. So what we'll see is all the way up until World War II, pretty much every time after we fight a war, during the war we see economic growth, but then after the war, what we see is economic recession or economic bad times. After World War II, that won't happen because we go directly into the Cold War, so we keep spending on the military. But and other reasons. We'll talk about those during the World War II lectures. So, because of the Mexican American War and then later the Spanish American War, what we see is there is this boom in industry. And so, pictures of Spanish American War and the Mexican American War. All right. So, how does capitalism work, right? What's the system? Well, the system is based on the division of labor. We're moving from craftsmen, where one person built a rifle, and we're just going to use a rifle, but just think any finished good, by hand, right? When one person built it by hand, every single rifle was unique. It was probably really good quality, but it would take weeks to produce one rifle. Well, if it took me a week to produce one rifle, I got to charge a lot of money for that rifle, right? Because I got to pay for my rent and all that kind of stuff. And so, really, only rich people could afford it. Right. Well, what the manufacturing does is it divides labor up into smaller parts. And so, because Eli Whitney, invents the interchangeable parts, what you do is you make every part of the rifle the same. So every barrel is exactly the same. Every trigger is exactly the same. Every stock's exactly the same. Every sight's exactly the same. And then once you make all of those exactly the same, assembly is easy. You just, if one person just makes barrels all day, one person just makes stocks all day, they can make, they 10, 20, 30, 100 of them a day. And then you got one person that just assembles it all of a sudden now you don't have to spend your whole life training to build a gun from start to finish. You can learn to make a barrel essentially overnight, and you can make hundreds of them a day. And so, if you get 6 different people that each do one small part of building that rifle, you can build, instead of one rifle a week, you can build 10, 15 rifles in one day, right? And then you hire a manager to oversee those workers that are doing essentially, menial, unskilled work. So that's called specialization. When you take a craftsman to build one whole gun, if you specialize with a bunch of different people just learning how to build one small part, that's reducing the work to simple labor, which you could do much faster. And that's specialization. This will make possible the assembly line. And no, Henry Ford did not invent the assembly line. Henry Ford is going to innovate the assembly line with a moving assembly line, and so he's going to be the one that makes it large scale and is going to make it incredibly efficient. The first assembly lines are actually in the cattle butchering industry in Chicago. They've been doing it for a while, but once we get standardized parts where every part of the gun is the same, then I make a barrel, I hand it over to the person who makes the stock. They slap those two together, and then they hand it over to the person that made the sights. They slap it on, and then they hand it over to the person that puts the trigger guard on or whatever. Then the rifle's complete. And so that's going to make things faster, and we've talked about that several times. Making products faster makes them cheaper. Making products cheaper means more people can buy them, which makes businesses more money, but also because you're selling more products, it makes it creates more jobs. Right. And then we're going to try and mechanize as much of that system as possible. When we're talking about Edward Drake and the steam drill, instead of having, a business that has to hire 100 people to dig a hole, if you can use a steam engine, steam drill to be able to drill that hole, you don't have to pay. You pay one person to manage the drill to dig that hole instead of paying 100 people, which brings costs down for for the iron, which means you're going to sell more iron. And we get more iron products out there, which are a better product compared to the previously used wooden product. All of this is essentially referred to as scientific management. It's applying science to the building of things, right? Breaking down tasks into small parts, using standardized tools to be able to make the system as efficient as. Now, as these companies get bigger and bigger, they're going to have to start to figure out ways to organize their businesses to make things as efficient and as cheap as possible so they can lower the prices of their goods, hopefully, to sell stuff or to eliminate all of their competition. So, you don't have to. So lower your prices, you can charge people whatever you want. So as the businesses are growing, there's two different ways for these businesses to essentially dominate the market for whatever they're selling. And so one of those ways is vertical integration. And so that's on the far left of your screen over here. And so vertical integration is when you own every step of the process for making your product. And so in the example, you see the cattle industry. Well, if I just sell steaks in Chicago, right? I can't control my prices. I want to sell the cheapest steak possible so the most people will buy it. So I make the most amount of money. Well, I can't lower my prices because if the cattle ranchers decide to raise their prices, I got to pay more for the cattle. So that's going to cost me more money and I'm going to have to pass that on to the consumer, right? Or if the railroad company decides that they're going to charge me more money to have that cow shipped to me, or if the butcher, the person that actually cuts up the cow, decides to raise prices, then I'm going to make less money, so I have to charge more for my steak. So if I really want to sell steak and I want to be able to sell steak as cheap as possible so everybody buys my steak in Chicago, what I need to do is I need to own the cattle ranch. I need to own the slaughterhouse, the railroad, the cooler warehouses, the delivery wagons, and the store selling the meat. Because if I do that, then those other companies aren't. If I own all that price, I can operate all that at cost, and I don't have people charging me extra fees or raising my my cost of doing business. And so my stake, because I've invested all my profits in buying these new parts of the company, all of a sudden now my steak is the cheapest. I could charge 25% less for my steak than everybody else, which means everybody's going to be buying from me rather than the high price steak. This is the way we want businesses to organize, because it means cheaper products for us, the consumer. The other way to organize is horizontal integration, or otherwise known as a monopoly. It's when you don't buy one of every step, you buy all of one step in the process, right? The perfect example of that is John D. Rockefeller with Standard Oil Company. He didn't own the oil wells. He didn't own the railroads. He didn't own, the storefronts. He didn't bother with all that. What he decided to do was he was going to own all of the refineries. So he was going to buy all of the places that took oil and turned it into kerosene and then later gas. And if you own all of one step, if you want oil, you have to buy it from Rockefeller, right? And so that means he can charge whatever he wants. You can't walk across the street and buy oil, or kerosene, I should say, from somebody cheaper. You have to buy it from Rockefeller, which means he can raise prices to whatever he wants. That's monopoly. Today, that's highly regulated. And so, for the most part in America, monopolies are illegal, with the exception of like Major League Baseball. Congress says that's okay. I don't know why, but they do. Because this allows companies to price gouge and to essentially raise prices. This is the type of thing we don't want, because this doesn't lower prices. This actually does the opposite. It allows businesses to raise prices to whatever they want, and that's not good for us, the consumer. So here's just another way to visualize vertical integration and horizontal integration. Vertical, owning every step in the process. Horizontal, owning all of one step and essentially none of the others. The reality is very few companies just vertically integrate or just horizontally integrate. Rockefeller, who horizontally integrates, he also dabbles in other industries. Transportation. He built a pipeline to kind of cut out the railroad, so he does get into transportation. So it's not ever as clean as what these charts are showing, but you get the basic idea. So, one of the first major industries in America is the textile industry. And so, one of the great examples of that is going to be Waltham and Lowell. This is, back pre Civil War in the 1810s and 20s. It is the textile industry. They are going to be really great examples of industrialization. They're going to use a power loom. Waltham and Lowell, these the factories are going to be built next to rivers. They're going to use, and a lot of the early factories were, because they're going to use the water as water power to be able to power these power looms. And they're going to essentially bring all the processes of making textiles under one roof, right? And so that by consolidating all the parts of the process, they're going to be able to make goods quicker, and which means they can make more of it, which means they can make it cheaper, and more people will buy. And so they consolidate that all under one roof. Before, they used what was called the putting out system. And so, you might, as your factory might make a bolt of cloth, but then you would hire just some woman on a farm somewhere. You'd give her that bolt of cloth, and you would pay her to turn that bolt of cloth into a specific design or something like that. She would work on it essentially in the evenings or when she had time, and then she would get paid when she brought a finished product back to you. That took forever. The quality of the product wasn't guaranteed, and so it wasn't a very efficient way to make money. What Waltham and Lowell did was what the Waltham and Lowell factories did are going to put all of that under one roof. And when it's under one roof, you can make things quicker, and you're going to make a more consistent product, which is going to allow you to make more money. Most of the people in this factory are going to be young women. This is going to give like unmarried young women an opportunity to make some money for their families, right? All the young men in a family are working on the farm. They're adding economic value to the family. The young women were a lot of times viewed as an economic disadvantage to a family. So you wanted to marry them off as soon as possible. That's why dads were willing to pay a dowry to get their daughters married to somebody. So I'll marry my daughter, and I'll give you 2 chickens and a goat. Because dad didn't want to have to continue to pay for his daughter anymore. He wanted some other man to be able to help pay for his daughter. And that wasn't like selling off the daughter, by the way, because the man needed, marriage back then was not about love. It was an economic arrangement. So, the men who were doing this tough physical labor all day needed a wife to be able to stay at home, and, not stay at home because like, I'm going to keep you at home, but somebody had to do the cooking and the cleaning in a world without washing machines and vacuum cleaners and microwave ovens. That stuff took all day. Plus, there's no daycare. If you're going to have kids, somebody's got to watch after the kids. There's no baby formula. So if you want to feed a kid, a woman has to do it. And so the division of labor just made sense back then. But if you had a daughter that couldn't find a husband, then all of a sudden that could potentially be an economic burden to you. And so what you would do is you would send your daughter to one of these textile factories. They would live in a dorm. Waltham and Lowell had dorms for women. Very strict rules. There was curfews, chaperones. They would have to go to church on Sunday and learn manners, because the idea was they're working and making money for their family, but eventually they'd be taught lessons in manners and stuff that would make them more appealing to get married, because the goal wasn't to work. The goal was to eventually get married and move out with your husband and raise a family. So, what are the results of industrialization? We're going to see handmade and homemade products be replaced by machine-made factory products, which is going to reduce the cost, which is going to make much more products available to the public, We're going to see investing in new services and goods. Everybody is always looking for a new product to sell that will make people's lives better because you can make a fortune doing it. Or if you can figure out a way to make things cheaper, then people will buy your product. And so there's just this natural system that's going to help create new products and cheaper products, which is going to make everybody's lives better, including the poor. Plus, the business owners are going to recognize that if they want to stay on top, their profits, they can't just go out and spend it on, gigantic mansions, which they will do. But they need to take the majority of their products and invest it back into their business so they can stay on top, which means vertically integrating and or creating more factories, which creates more jobs. And so capitalism really encourages businesses and business owners and people with money to take their money and put it back in the economy so they can ultimately make more money. But when it goes back in the economy, it creates more jobs and newer services and better products. We're going to see more products available for less money, right? We've been talking about that this entire lesson, which makes a higher standard of living. That just means your life is more comfortable, and that's for everybody, rich, poor, everybody. Clearly, the rich are always going to benefit more from that, but you got to be able to have rich people because you incentivize. If you don't allow, like in a socialist system where you just don't allow anybody to be rich, you don't have people creating new businesses and encouraging people. There's no incentive to taking the risk to building a new product if you can't get yourself up into that upper class. And so we're going to see individual wealth for some, just insane individual wealth for some big businesses. And they're going to take it too far. They're going to take it too far because they're going to keep all the wealth at the top and not pay their employees enough, even when they get to a place where they can pay their employees more. This is the problem with laissez-faire capitalism, which is an unregulated capitalism. And so there's going to start to be a demand for things like minimum wages, maximum hours, which eventually will happen. It's going to be a long process. We'll start, unions are going to play an essential role in that. And then the growth of cities. You got to have you got to have a strong workforce to have factories, and so that means if in a world without cars, you have to essentially live within walking distance of the factory you work at, which means one factory can have thousands and thousands of employees, and so that means cities, right? So cities are going to pop up where these factories are, or factories are going to pop up where the cities are because that's where the workers are. This will increase world trade. Eventually, we'll get to the point where we make more goods than just what Americans will buy, which means we have to start selling things to other countries, which is going to lead to thoughts of imperialism. Now, American imperialism will not be nearly as bad as European imperialism, but it ain't going to be great. So we'll talk about that in a future lecture. And then, like we've been talking about this entire lecture as well, there are going to be businesses that abuse the system because the government is not regulating them and controlling them enough to make sure that there aren't abuses. All right. I know we went through this really quick. This was a long lecture. I appreciate you following along, and I will see you again shortly.